It promised so much, it was exciting and everybody wanted it to succeed, but it went wrong almost from the very start. After gaining many fans with the Delta Wing and the PlayStation Academy, Nissan was ready to take the next step. It ignored the failure of the Zeod and it forged ahead regardless. This is the story of the top-class Le Mans prototype that launched on the moon but ended up in a dumpster. This is the story of a hugely ambitious but bizarre front-engined front-wheel drive design that actually almost worked, but ultimately proved to be an overly complex disaster. This is the story of the Nissan GT-R LM NISMO. In 2013, Nissan announced its second Garage 56 entry at Le Mans, the Zeod. The car was granted an entry to the 2014 Le Mans 24 Hours race on the understanding that it would be the precursor to an all-new Works LMP1 entry from the Japanese manufacturer into the World Endurance Championship. On the 23rd of May 2014, that LMP1 project was finally confirmed. The shape underneath the cover that you see here was not actually a real car, it was just some boxes arranged to look like there was a car underneath the cover. It was perhaps a sign of what was to come. There's probably a lesson there. At the launch, Nissan's COO, Andy Palmer, made it clear that this new Le Mans campaign would be no half-baked effort.
We're not going to go to Le Mans and compete in this historic race with the intention of just turning up and making a nice marketing sideshow. Our intention is to win.
He would come to regret those words. Indeed, those in the room later claimed that they were stunned and concerned when they heard them, and they were right to be a little bit stunned and concerned. Ben Bowlby, who is undeniably something of a genius, would be responsible for the car's design. He had dreamt up the Delta Wing and the Zeod and had also converted a train tunnel into an aerodynamic test facility. Now he was to design this all-new Nissan LMP1 car, but Palmer had made it very clear to Bowlby that this car could not just be a conventional design. After the marketing success of the Delta Wing, he demanded that the new LMP1 car be different.
Well, turning up in a vehicle which is basically another hybrid that looks like another Porsche, Audi or Toyota, I don't know, they all look the same to me. Our intention is to do something that is a little bit different. To be frank, what we really want to be is a little bit of a bad boy.
This was a challenge that Bowlby embraced fully. Indeed, he relished it. Bowlby believed that he'd found a loophole in the technical regulations that would permit a very different type of Le Mans prototype, and one nobody had ever really considered before. Details of the project were initially kept a closely guarded secret until the car's design was finally revealed during the second quarter of the 2015 Super Bowl, obviously, and it was a slightly odd advert, it's fair to say. Another even stranger commercial appeared around the same time, which showed the car on the moon. Nissan certainly was not planning to do things the normal way. The moon commercial and the Super Bowl advert revealed a fascinating car design that looked quite unlike anything else. Palmer's task had been met. Nissan had clearly designed a front-engined Le Mans prototype, the first since the Panoz LMP07, which raced over a decade earlier. But closer inspection soon revealed another key detail. This new car wasn't just front-engined, it was also front-wheel drive. The car was essentially backwards. Bowlby felt that other manufacturers had all been led into a single conventional car design philosophy because the technical regulations had evolved to limit car performance by making it hard to generate efficient downforce at the rear of the car. Indeed, the size and the shape of the rear wing were tightly restricted. However, at the front of the car, the rules were far less restrictive, and nobody had really tried to exploit this area, so the rule makers hadn't really given it as much thought. Bowlby realised that if he designed a car around the concept of generating as much front downforce as possible, he would be able to create a car capable of generating a really good level of downforce extremely efficiently. In other words, with a lot less drag than would have otherwise been possible. To make that new concept work, he would need to design a car with a major shift forwards in terms of the weight distribution and the tyre loading. And he thought to himself, with that objective in mind, why not just build a front-engined car? And with all of that extra load over the front wheels, why not have the front wheels as the main driving wheels as well? So that's exactly what he did. As a Works LMP1 entry, the Nissan, by regulation, would have to have been a hybrid. Some of the R&D work on the Zeod was intended to have been the groundwork for the LMP1 hybrid system, but ultimately, and perhaps a little bizarrely, Bowlby opted to use a purely mechanical hybrid system rather than continue with an electronic system. This later turned out to be a huge mistake. The Flybrid Toratrack hybrid system was selected. This concept was one of the very first hybrid systems proposed for Formula One when that series introduced hybrid systems, but at the time it was called Kinetic Energy Recovery Systems, or KERS. And putting aside the 1998 McLaren hybrid system, this was one of the very first designs available. It stored its energy in either a single or twin contra-rotating flywheel and deployed it to the transmission and the rear wheels via a set of gears and clutches. This would not actually be the first use of the Flybrid system at the Le Mans 24 Hours. An earlier version of it, seen here, was used on the Hope Pole Vision Swiss high-tech Courage Oreca in the 2011 race. Audi also used a flywheel-based energy storage system on its hybrid LMP1 car, rather than a conventional battery or capacitor pack as found on the Toyota and the Porsche. But the German team opted to have an electromechanical arrangement rather than purely mechanical as found on the Nissan. On paper, the system on the Audi would have had a lower potential output, but it was a lot less complex to implement. The Nissan system, on the other hand, would in theory be a lot more powerful, but also a lot more complex. On the test bench, it was claimed that the dual flywheel hybrid system designed for the new Nissan was capable of 1100 brake horsepower on its own. It was designed to operate in the 8 megajoule LMP1 subclass. If the hybrid system had worked as intended, the GT-R LM NISMO would have had over 1500 brake horsepower, and all four wheels would have at times on the lap been driven, though the reality of what happened was actually quite different. The combustion engine would drive the front wheels only, while the hybrid system would be able to drive the front wheels but also the smaller rear wheels as well, via a long shaft running through the length of the car. The rules actually allowed Nissan to fit a second rear-mounted energy recovery system, but Bowlby opted not to do that, and I think that's something he later regretted. Fitting an additional system at the rear of the car would have meant that there was no need for a big long shaft running through the middle of the chassis, but Bowlby initially rejected the idea of a secondary rear-mounted energy recovery system, as it would have shifted the weight distribution of the car too far rearward. In LMP1 at the time, manufacturers could choose different levels of hybrid system performance, from 2 megajoules of energy up to the maximum 8 megajoules of energy. In the 2 megajoule subclass, the car could deploy up to 2 megajoules of energy from the hybrid system and use quite a lot of fuel as well. A car with a 4 megajoule system would have a little less fuel, and it continued all the way up to 8 megajoules with the lowest fuel allocation, but potentially the most potent hybrid system. A hybrid system at the highest level could deploy an awful lot of power in a short time, or a little power for a long time, and that's what Nissan opted to do. To optimise this concept, Nissan commissioned Cosworth to develop a new, relatively low power but very high efficiency combustion engine. That engine, which became known as the VRX30A, was a 3-litre twin-turbo V6 featuring direct injection. It was actually based, at least in terms of some of its design concept and its combustion chamber design, on Cosworth's unraced 2014 Formula One power unit. The engine proved to be capable of having very high efficiency, and it also had very good drivability at low RPM. It also had a huge amount of torque and quite a flat power curve. This meant that the Nissan would only need a 5-speed transmission, which in theory would mean fewer gear shifts and less wear and tear on the gearbox as a whole, something really useful in an endurance race. According to the late Ricardo Davila, the ACO, which had access to all of the data on all of the cars, told him that the Nissan Cosworth was actually one of the 2 best engines used in Le Mans prototypes at that time. Unfortunately, he never said which the other engine was. The engine had a 60-degree cylinder bank angle compared to the 90-degree cylinder bank angle on the Formula One V6 from Cosworth. When you look at the installation of the engine into the car, it becomes pretty clear very fast that mechanically the overall arrangement of the car was truly backwards. The conventional layout for a racing car was front axle, then the monocoque, the engine, the gearbox, and then the rear axle with the driven wheels. But the Nissan completely inverted that. The front axle was not only steered, but it was also driven. Behind it was the gearbox, and then the engine, then the hybrid system, and we'll come back to that, and then the monocoque. And finally behind the monocoque was the rear axle in its own sort of special sub-chassis. To achieve this unusual layout, the car was divided into core modules. The front module consisted of the front splitter at front impact structure and some of the cooling system. Behind that sat the gearbox, the engine and the hybrid system. Then there was the monocoque we've talked about, and then behind that there was the rear module, which housed the rear impact structure, the differential, the rear drive shafts and suspension, and that was all housed in this removable composite structure which also carried the rear wing. With the backwards layout of the car, the suspension layout was quite interesting. On paper it was a conventional double wishbone layout, but the front suspension picked up on, well, the structures in the front of the car, you'll see later, while the rear suspension picked up on that rear module I talked about, and the whole subassembly mounted to the rear of the monocoque. The aerodynamics of the car also looked completely out of this world. The car was launched on the moon after all. The concept was all about maximising front downforce and keeping the drag of the car as low as possible. That meant a really big front splitter, a massive front diffuser, and tunnels that ran through the car. And these tunnels were not just about reducing aerodynamic drag, they also assisted with that front downforce generation. At the rear there was a conventional diffuser, the tunnel exits, and a fairly skinny twin-plane rear wing. Aerodynamic development of the car was extensive. A huge amount of CFD work was done, a 40% scale model was tested in the Mercedes F1 wind tunnel in Brackley, and full-scale wind tunnel testing was done at Windshear in North Carolina. The car was clearly designed specifically for Le Mans. It would be very fast in a straight line and very good in high-speed corners as well, but that's about it. This meant the car would be compromised on pretty much every other track, but Nissan didn't mind that so much, and even though a higher downforce version of the car was planned, Le Mans was what it really was all about, because that race offered the greatest marketing returns. Even with the focus just being on Le Mans, the aerodynamic concept of the car did come with some serious engineering trade-offs, mostly coming as a result of the through-car tunnels, which took up a lot of space in some critical areas. For example, at the rear, the drive arrangements from the hybrid system were completely wild. A shaft ran forwards from the hybrid system module through the tight V of the V6 engine to the gearbox, which allowed it to deploy energy to the front wheels. But the connection to the rear wheels was just mind-boggling. A torque vectoring differential was mounted on the centre line of the car in the rear module. From there, the drive shafts ran out either side below the tunnels. However, this meant that the drive shafts were actually too low to meet the centre of the rear wheels, so additional shafts and joints were needed to get the drive upwards and outwards to the centre line of those rear wheels. It was a hugely complex system, and I suspect hugely lossy. Another issue with a similar cause was found at the front of the car. The radiators had to be mounted in front of the engine to avoid the through-car tunnels, which in turn meant that any front splitter change, something that's essentially inevitable on one of these cars at some point, could take as much as an hour to be done. On a normal car, that same job would probably just take a few minutes at most. But with the Nissan, the whole cooling system would have to be drained, bled, and refilled just for the splitter to be able to be changed. Despite these trade-offs, the overall weight distribution goals of the car were actually met. The centre of mass was actually in front of the windscreen, and the car had a 65% front aero balance and a 66% front weight distribution. With the 8 megajoule hybrid system, this was great for Bowlby's approach of harvesting energy at the front and deploying it at the rear of the car. But if anything went wrong with that hybrid system, the brakes would take an absolute hammering. In my opinion, one of the biggest problems for the GT-R LM was the choice to build and run the project from the USA, far away from the traditional centre of motorsport engineering in Europe. Japan would arguably have been a better option too. Nismo has a very established supply chain there. The USA, on the other hand, hadn't produced a top-level international racing car in many years, and there were real doubts that the USA even had the capability to build a top-class international racing car. But Bowlby believed that working in the USA had some distinct advantages. For example, he felt that it massively widened the talent pool because he wasn't competing with Formula 1 teams and other LMP1 teams for the best engineering staff. So the initial car build began at Dan Gurney's All-American Racers, which had also built the first Delta Wing, although that had used an Aston Martin chassis made in England. The new Nissan chassis would be built by AAR, and I think the last time that they'd built a composite chassis race car from scratch was in 1999 1999 with the Eagle 997. Things started to go wrong quite early. Because of the complexity of the GT-R LM project, AAR actually pulled out of the project after finishing the first monocoques, and the project was then forced to relocate from California to Indianapolis, a huge distance. And partly because of this, the staff found themselves initially living in rented accommodation, and moving right across the USA meant that some of the staff just left the project because they weren't willing to uproot their families and lives. There were other practical issues as well. Having the main facility in the USA and then having significant parts of the car such as the engine, the hybrid system, and in theory the gearbox made in the UK massively increased the lead times of everything, and time differences really interfered with communication as well. There were other delays on top of that. All of the facilities in the UK capable of making a high quality gearbox casing, for example, were fully booked, and this directly resulted in an engineering compromise being made on the car. The gearbox casing that Bowlby envisaged just wasn't possible within the time available. The UK companies couldn't make it, so they had to look around in the US to make the gearbox casing. There was a plan to CNC machine the casing from a solid billet, but eventually a company was found in Detroit which could rapid cast the casing. But all of this slowed down the development of the car, and it massively reduced the quality of the gearbox and increased its weight significantly. At one point, Bowlby ended up flying around Europe, back and forwards across the Atlantic as well, for meetings and to collect parts of the car and bring them back to the factory, or from the factory to the suppliers, as excess baggage. It wasn't an ideal situation, and again it led to project delays. Ultimately, the first car did get to start testing at Nissan's facility in Arizona. The shakedown of the first car was a month late, and things went wrong almost immediately. The car wasn't actually finished, as the bodywork design hadn't actually been completed at that point and the body panels hadn't been made. So the top speed of the car in those initial tests was restricted to 130 mph for safety reasons. Then the main shaft in the gearbox broke and holed that new casing, and there were no spares available, so the gearbox main case had to be patched up with epoxy resin for the rest of the test to continue. More importantly, that first test took place without a hybrid system being fitted to the car. The first hybrid system in fact didn't arrive until a month later, and when it did arrive, it didn't work properly. The system featured two 8kg flywheels, each spinning at 60,000 RPM. The system's promised output had reduced from 1100 brake horsepower seen in bench testing down to about a 700 brake horsepower boost for a maximum of 5 seconds. But combined with the Cosworth engine, this would still give the car up to about 1200 brake horsepower, except it didn't work out like that. When the hybrid system arrived, it was found that the system losses when fitted to the car dropped the output of the hybrid system down to just 175 brake horsepower, and that's when it worked, and it didn't work most of the time. And even if it did work, the energy stored up to deliver that power decayed completely if it wasn't deployed within 10 seconds of being harvested, a result of the clutch arrangement between the storage medium and the transmission. It was clear to the team very early on that the hybrid system would take some more time to get working, and the rear-wheel drive system with its complex driveshaft arrangement and torque vectoring differential was never actually fitted to the car. There was also a torque vectoring differential designed for the front of the car. It was tested on the bench but never actually fitted. So the hybrid system ultimately would become a very expensive lump of ballast. Switching to a capacitor-based electronic hybrid system was actually considered for a brief moment, but it was considered too late for the team to change the layout of the car at that point. So the difficult decision was made to downscale the hybrid system to the 2 megajoule subclass at Le Mans. This would give the Cosworth V6 a bit more fuel to work with, and as such increase its output. The initial idea was to get the hybrid system working on the front axle only, but in reality it hardly ever worked properly, and by the time the car arrived at Le Mans, it was disconnected. It truly was ballast. This hybrid system issue was a much bigger problem than the mere reduction in power. Adopting a powerful 8 megajoule hybrid system meant that the front brakes could be significantly downsized, as the hybrid system harvesting would decelerate the car significantly. But if it was not running at the required performance level, or not working at all as the case really was, then the front brakes would very quickly be overloaded, and it was found in testing straight away that the front brakes were constantly cooking and failing, and there were some crashes as a result in testing. To address this, the front brake cooling package was increased over and over again, but nothing seemed to really work, and the car clearly simply needed bigger bigger brakes, but these wouldn't fit into the existing 16-inch front wheel rims. It was clear then that larger brakes meant that larger wheels would also be needed on the car. So in March 2015, really not long before the cars needed to ship out to Le Mans, it was decided that the front wheels should be enlarged to an 18-inch rim size to accommodate the largest brakes possible. BBS quickly made the new magnesium alloys and got them to the team, but there was another problem. A new wheel size would mean that new tyres would be needed at the front of the car. The problem was that the GT-R LM placed unique demands on the front tyres. Michelin had developed a bespoke tyre for the car, capable of both steering and being driven. They'd worked really hard on it, and that tyre had quite tall sidewalls, and these absorbed a lot of shock loads from things like curbs. The front tyres were also significantly wider than the rears. However, these bespoke tyres wouldn't fit the new front wheels, but by this point Le Mans was only 2 or 3 months away, and there wasn't time for Michelin to develop a new tyre for the car. In fact, there wasn't even time for new tyres to be made at all. Nissan would have to use existing tyres, and as all of the new racing tyres which Michelin had made had already been allocated to other teams, these tyres would have to come from existing stocks, which meant they were probably 1 or 2 years old in reality, and they were most certainly not designed for a front-engine, front-wheel drive car. These new old tyres also had a lower profile and stiffer sidewalls, so more bumps and knocks were transmitted through the tyres to the suspension, and it turned out that the suspension wasn't actually strong enough. Breakages were constant, and as a result the drivers were told to stay off the curbs at all times, especially at Le Mans, which had new, more aggressive curbs introduced that year. It was another factor which worsened lap times. Another major issue for the new Nissan was the chassis itself. It's not quite clear why, but the Nissan project overall started to clash with the FIA, and the FIA would not homologate the GT-R LM chassis at all. In fact, it failed a number of the required homologation, impact and load tests. Crash testing the car wasn't a straightforward process anyway, because the whole front crash test, for example, was pretty bizarre, as the front impact structure mounted to the gearbox, which then mounted to the engine, and that in turn was mounted to the chassis. So Nissan essentially had to crash test the engine, a really unusual occurrence. At least one of the main homologation tests was failed in early 2015. The front roll hoop load test failed at 73.5 kilonewtons out of a design target of 75 kilonewtons. A small failure, but a failure nonetheless. Additionally, the FIA would not approve of the installation of the hybrid system, so the chassis itself had to be modified to meet the demands of the FIA. Though there was at this point a feeling within the team that the rules were being applied differently by the FIA, or certainly interpreted differently by the FIA, to the way Bowlby and the rest of the team believed it should be interpreted. Nonetheless, the FIA insisted, so the changes had to be made to the front bulkhead of the chassis. These changes made quite the impact to the hybrid system, or at least how easy it would have been to access. Because of the changes to the front bulkhead, the only way to access the hybrid system parts would be through the windscreen, and to change the hybrid system, the whole unit would have to come out and pass in and out through the windscreen of the car. It was a difficult and time-limiting job. Well, it would have been if the system actually worked, which it didn't, so the team never really had to do those jobs. The front roll hoop load test was failed again, and the FIA had also unexpectedly introduced a load test on the door of the car, and it failed that too. So a new door and latch system had to be developed for the chassis at quite short notice, and the front roll hoop had to be significantly modified. It was originally bonded onto the tub, and that just wasn't working out, so that eventually the front roll hoop structure had to be laminated into the tub, and it finally passed the crash tests. Now, these crash tests didn't actually destroy the chassis being submitted to the tests, it was just those front roll hoops. The chassis was later modified and used as one of the race cars. Taking the tub for its final crash test though, the new Nissan LMP1 chassis had to face a slightly unusual fate. It had to be transported by one of the team members on the open rear deck of their Toyota pickup truck, and that is not something anybody at Nissan would have wanted to have seen. Those crash test failures were reported in the media to have massively delayed the project, but the reality is that they didn't delay the project at all, because the car didn't actually work properly at that point anyway. Track testing had already begun with the car, and after the shakedown and initial runs in Arizona, and some running at the Circuit of the Americas in Texas, as well as a few other circuits, the cars were taken to the National Corvette Museum in Kentucky, which has its own test track next to I-65. While at times it seems likely that the mechanics in particular would have liked to have pushed the cars into the sinkhole in the museum, the Bowling Green, Kentucky track was not as unlikely a test venue as it may have first have seemed. The track, while small, could be run in a configuration that sort of replicated Le Mans, with a 1,000 metre straight to represent the Mulsanne. The PlayStation chicane was sort of replicated, there was a bit of the Porsche curves, and Tertre Rouge as well could all sort of be replicated on this track layout, so it was a useful venue to run a new Le Mans car at. However, the more the car tested, the more problems began to surface. It quickly became clear that the car was an absolute nightmare to work on. The hugely complex front end was completely wild. You can see it here. The engine air inlet, for example, had to be routed through the front impact structure where the air filter was located, then around the suspension to the turbocharger, then back through the suspension underneath the turbocharger, and then through the intercoolers and finally to the plenum. And you can just see the huge amount of complexity in that engine bay. And in fact, when you look at it from this angle, the engine itself is almost impossible to see. So it's fair to say that the testing process was not smooth. Indeed, at times the cars had to run on slicks in wet conditions as there were no wet tyres available at some points. And at this point, most of the other LMP1 teams were running 25-hour tests and longer at tracks like Sebring and getting ready for the start of the season. Nissan at the time was struggling to keep the car even running for a single stint. Another serious issue started to emerge once the testing had got underway properly and the team was able to run more than a single lap without a stoppage. The front of the car started to violently bounce at high speed, especially when the car was running at a high rake angle in the configuration where it had the highest amount of downforce. Extensive modifications to the setup and to the car itself were made, but the car kept on doing this. When it did it, it often ended up breaking the front splitter, causing more long delays as the radiators had to be drained out to change the splitter. This phenomenon was actually replicated in the wind shear wind tunnel, and the hop was so severe that it was lifting the front wheels off the moving belt in that wind tunnel. Video of this does exist, but I was unable to get it for this channel. I have seen it and it's pretty scary. I also did hear a rumour of one of the cars flipping in the wind shear wind tunnel, but I don't actually know how true that is. It was around this point where the first driver Nissan signed for the 2015 season, Marc Genet, had decided he'd had enough of it all and he quit the project. Once the Nissan was able to run long enough to be able to set some representative lap times at Bowling Green, an established Nissan-powered Zytec LMP2 team, Greaves Motorsport, joined the works team in Kentucky. The purpose of having this LMP2 car there was to benchmark the pace of the LMP1 car at the track, and those simulations turned out to pretty accurately model the LMP2 pace at Le Mans, and using the same system it was forecast that the LMP1 car should be able to lap Le Mans at a pace of around 3 minutes and 20 seconds, even with its hybrid system not actually working. It was a slower pace than expected, but it wasn't a complete embarrassment. Getting the drivers prepared for Le Mans was a challenge. Not all of the cars were ready, and there were 9 drivers across 3 cars entered for the Le Mans 24 hours, and that meant a lot of seat fittings, and ultimately none of the drivers particularly liked the positioning of the pedals or indeed the steering wheel. The drivers didn't like the handling much either. Staying off the curbs to protect the suspension cost them a lot of time and meant they had to modify their racing lines, and without the hybrid system it was found that the rear wheels locked up really easily, which would flat spot the tyres and in turn damage the fragile rear suspension even more. At the front it was found that the new wheels and tyres didn't deliver the expected traction, again without that hybrid system. All of these problems resulted in something in a shift in goals for the team. Rather than being there to not make up the numbers and being there to win, the new GT-Rs would now be there to collect data for the 2016 race. Their main target then was to finish the Le Mans 24 hours, and this was, after all, Stroll the first year of a 3-year programme. The cars had been due to race at Silverstone and Spa prior to Le Mans, but they just weren't ready for those races, so 2 show cars were placed in the garages and fans were invited in. At Silverstone, one of these cars inexplicably appeared in a Manchester City football livery. It had also been at the team's training ground before the race, with some mixed reactions from the players. This was just another example of the massive media machine that was going on behind the whole LMP1 project. Let's not forget, Nissan had absolutely dominated marketing with the Delta Wing. They wanted to achieve the same with this new LMP1 project. When the team arrived at Le Mans, the work was really on to make sure that all 3 cars were ready for the start of the official test day, and a huge amount of work went into making sure that happened. And because of the sheer amount of work that had gone into the cars, Nissan's Eat, Sleep, Race, Repeat slogan, painted on the pit wall outside the garage, was modified by the mechanics. And even with the cars in those pit garages, the design of the car was continually being modified. Designs were being tweaked on laptops in the back of the garage, and manufacturing capability was desperately being sought out across Europe to make the improved parts. It was clear that the cars were just not ready for a race. Any race, let alone the Le Mans 24 hours. The ACO took exception, for example, to the positioning of the rear view mirrors on the car, and they felt that they should be relocated on the front wheel arches. New parts had to be made to satisfy this demand, and you can see that change here. This was a real frustration, or must have been a real frustration for Ben Bowlby, because just 1 year earlier, the very same officials had allowed the Nissan Zeod to run without any mirrors at all and rely on a rear view camera system instead. The GT-R LM had an improved version of that exact same system, and it gave drivers really good visibility in day or nighttime conditions, and in fact the drivers themselves said they didn't really use the mirrors on the car anyway. It was just an additional thing the team had to change. The skid blocks on the front splitters also had to be modified in the garage as well, creating a huge amount of sawdust and just general unpleasant working conditions for the mechanics. Despite all of these struggles, the 3 cars did line up in order as the first cars to leave the pits during the official Le Mans test day, and it was a good time to find out just how they would perform on the track that they were designed to run on. The fastest of the 3 cars was just 1.5 seconds off the pace. The pace of the best LMP2 car, that was. It was over 20 seconds a lap off the pace of the best LMP1 car. As expected though, the Nissan was the fastest car of all on the straight, and on the test day it hit 336 kph, but it could go faster. As expected though, reliability was a major issue, and the Nissans ran far fewer laps than the other LMP1 cars did. As the cars arrived for the ceremonial scrutineering procedure in the city centre, the team confirmed what they already knew. The cars were all significantly overweight by as much as 30 kilograms. Nissan improved its pace in qualifying, but it was still the slowest LMP1 car by some margin. But at least the cars were quicker than the LMP2 category. Well, one of the Nissans wasn't actually. The best lap of the Nissans had improved to a 3-minute 36.9, though that was still 20 seconds off the fastest time set by a Porsche 919 and still significantly slower than Nissan's pace estimates. The top speed advantage of the Nissan was gone as well as the other teams raised their performance levels, and while a top speed of 350 kph or more was thought possible with the Nissan, the car actually never topped 338 kph, and the fastest Audi exceeded 345 kph. These sessions gave the media and other teams a really good chance to look over the cars, and it quickly became clear that the fit and finish of the cars was utterly woeful, perhaps a symptom of the very split up manufacturing process, but just look at the various panels on the car in this onboard footage. Nothing really fits together properly. Indeed, on the morning of the race, the crew of the number 23 car had been awake for 32 hours just trying to get the floor to fit on the car properly. All 3 cars did line up for the ceremonial race start, but the 23 car failed to take the start and had to be pushed back into the garage, and it didn't get out on track until well after the race had actually started. It was a sign of things to come. Throughout the race, the pit stops regularly consisted of having to remove the front splitter, which now took less than an hour to do, but it still wasn't fast. The gearbox internals had to be checked, the clutches had to be replaced regularly, the brakes constantly, and the suspension often had to be changed as well because that was breaking braking all the time still. While other LMP1 teams made a routine stop in about a minute, the Nissans could take much longer. Every time the car stopped, for example, the exhaust shields had to be opened to cool down the turbochargers. Despite instructions to the drivers repeatedly being made, curb strikes were still damaging the suspension. As well as that, the second and third gear ratios would also fail frequently. Across all three cars, 9 gear cluster changes were made during the race. The 21 car was the first one to retire, with a wheel bearing failure after 115 laps. That resulted in the differential failing as the driver tried to limp home with one driven wheel, but the other two cars limped on in the race regardless of this. After sunrise and 234 laps completed, the 23 car had a front suspension failure which locked a wheel and overloaded the differential and essentially blew it up and caused a small fire. That was out of the race too, leaving just the 22 car, though whether the 22 car was truly in the race was somewhat debatable. Many people had believed that the 22 car had already retired. It had hit debris during the night and had spent 9.5 hours in the pits in total. But the mechanics hadn't quite given up on it, and it was fixed up enough for it to roll out of the garage at points and eventually complete the final lap, and this let Nissan claim it had achieved its target of finishing Le Mans. But with only 242 laps completed by the number 22 car, it was not a classified finisher. At the end of the race, the team gathered together, firstly in the pit lane and later in the hospitality unit, complete with a helter-skelter, for a warm beer and a bit of a commiseration session. People hugged and congratulated one another, not so much for the car's performances in the race, but simply because they all managed to get through the toughest 24-hour race of their lives. Even looking back at it now, some people refer to that gathering as the wake for the Nissan GT-R LM. But in reality, there was actually some optimism about what would come next. The problems with the cars were now very well understood, and there was a plan in place to fix those issues. In fact, work on the 2016 specification GT-R LM was already well underway before the cars even arrived at Le Mans. Instead of taking part in the WEC races which followed Le Mans, the cars were shipped back to the USA, and Nissan opted to withdraw the team from the World Endurance Championship, at least until it could fix the problems with the car. And in October 2015, Nissan announced that it would return to the WEC in 2016. Testing continued in the USA, and while a new hybrid system had not yet been sourced, a new brake package was being introduced with much larger ducting in the nose as well to keep them cool. This increased drag, but it did make the car actually work, which was quite important. The aerodynamic package was also revised to address the front hopping, and large front dive planes were added to the car as well. A front-to-rear interconnected suspension system was also trialled on this car, but it needed a bit more work. The 2016 version of the car would have featured a new hybrid system, an electronic hybrid system with electric motors at the rear of the car. This solved the complexities of the front-mounted hybrid system quite significantly. There was also a major rework of the serviceability of the car, and generally better build quality was targeted as well. More significantly, a major weight loss program was also underway. That weight reduction program would see 25 kilograms shed from the gearbox, that's a huge amount, 7 kilograms from the monocoques, 3 kilograms from the engine, and 10 kilos from the rear module, as well as 3 kilograms from the springs and dampers. The 2015 hybrid system weight was originally intended to come in at 126 kilograms, but had the full system with the twin flywheels and the through-car shaft ever been fully fitted, the actual weight came to closer to 150 kilograms. The new system, the new electronic system, would have been less than that, and as a bonus, it should have actually worked too. A high downforce version of the car was planned as well to make it a little bit more credible at tracks other than Le Mans. But despite this work continuing, rumours about the project were growing, and shortly before Christmas in 2015, it was announced to the employees that the programme would be cancelled with immediate effect. The reason for the cancellation were likely both political and financial. Some senior figures in the project had actually already left, including one of the organisation's biggest supporters, Andy Palmer, who'd gone off to join Aston Martin. And as the cost of the new hybrid system was thought to be quite high, I do wonder if some of the bookkeepers had said this project is just too expensive. Once it became clear that the project was likely to be cancelled though, an alternative and intriguing suggestion was raised. Why not run the cars in LMP2? Even if the Cosworth engine couldn't be adapted to running on an LMP2 air restrictor, with the hybrid system removed, it might be possible to squeeze in a well-proven Nissan VK45DE LMP2 engine. While works teams were officially banned at Le Mans, Alpine had been racing in LMP2 for some time with what was clearly a works team. Nissan could do something similar and work with some of its long-standing customer teams like Team Impel or even Team RJN, which had formed part of the LMP1 project anyway, to run cars that were definitely not works cars. The required gentleman driver seats in an LMP2 team could be handed over to celebrities like Chris Hoy, who already had a relationship with the team, or gamer to racer drivers who were already in those seats. But this concept was rejected. Nissan went to Le Mans to win and ended up embarrassing itself. It just wanted those cars to go away. Interestingly, the Nissan Cosworth engine from the GT-R LM did actually return to racing. It actually returned to the Le Mans 24 Hours, and it was fitted to the Colin Colles run CLM LMP1. That is another story. It is one of the only parts of the GT-R LM project which actually survived, though two of the show cars produced for the project also remain in existence. One is on display in the USA and the other one is in the Le Mans Museum. A significant amount of parts from the project were actually thrown away. They were thrown into landfill, put into a dumpster in early 2016, and many of them were the brand new 2016 specification parts which had been paid for and had arrived after the project's cancellation. I believe this might even have included new chassis, new monocoques. Those parts are now probably all buried in landfill somewhere in Indiana. The race cars themselves seemed to disappear at this point. I was told that they'd all been crushed and certified as destroyed, but I've also heard rumours that at least one complete car, possibly the blue number 21 car, was quietly shipped off to Japan, where Nismo still has it hidden away in deep storage somewhere. It seems like such a shame that the project ended like this. It was an embarrassment in the end, but I do believe that had the 2016 changes been made to the car, especially the new hybrid system, then the car might have been a lot more competitive at Le Mans in 2016. The project was hugely ambitious, and indeed it was probably too ambitious at the time, and elements of the car were far too complex, and the execution of the project wasn't very good at all. However, on paper at least, the concept didn't seem to be entirely wrong. It's just its execution made it look laughable. It probably would never, as I say, have matched the front-running designs in LMP1 on pure pace, but it could have got a lot closer to them. However, it was a cascade of failures and poor choices that made the car uncompetitive, and maybe not the basic concept. I would love to have seen what it truly could have done. If you have enjoyed this overly complex piece of Le Mans history that was somewhat slower than expected, then please do hit like and subscribe, and I'll see you soon somewhere in the pit lane.